Proverbs 31 was read at my grandmother's funeral. It's one of those texts that many of you may remember that's popular for a grandparent's funeral. When I think about my grandmothers, I think about the regular rituals that many of us observe of going to a grandmother's house for Sunday lunch or dinner or whatever it is you refer to the midday meal as. My maternal grandmother was named Jenny Bruce. She was a good Southern woman, so she had two first names. She and my grandfather Leo had just one child, my mother Latrell. And my grandmother Jenny Bruce was a nurse. She worked for a local physician in the small South Georgia town where my parents grew up and where I later in life returned to live. And whenever she died, the doctor that she had worked for many years came to her funeral. And my dad approached him and thanked him for being there and said it meant a lot given the role he had played in her life. And he very quickly said to her, "There's no way I couldn't be here. What I didn't learn in medical school, your mother-in-law taught me." She was somebody who cared for other people in her family and in the neighborhood. In the small town where she lived, it was common for people to stop by in the evenings if they wanted her to check their blood pressure or take their temperature or ask her some medical question. She would also be known to occasionally give a shot to someone who was on insulin and was hesitant to do that for themselves. In the small town where she lived, none of the physicians lived within the city limits. They all lived just outside the city limits because they owned land. They were not only doctors, they were also gentlemen farmers. And there was nothing like 911 in this community, even when I lived there during the 80s. So it was not uncommon if somebody had a medical emergency in the middle of the night to say to somebody in the house, "Go over to Miss Jenny Bruce's house and knock on the corner window where her bedroom is." And she would go and she would tend to somebody. She would be the first responder. And she was a great cook in that sort of tradition of Southern cooks. Whenever she and my grandfather went, just the two of them, to a church covered dish supper, she alone would bring enough food to feed everybody in the church. There'd be one or two casseroles, like a broccoli or a squash casserole. She was known for her caramel cake, something that many people enjoy and that few people have been able to duplicate even following her recipe. She would usually prepare cornbread. I grew up with hard cornbread made in a skillet, something I haven't found outside of South Georgia. And of course, she would fry chicken. And so she'd bring all of that, just the two of them. And then later on, talking to my sister or some friend, she would badmouth some family of four who showed up for the meal and only brought a jar of pickles. That's the kind of food we would enjoy when we would go to her house for Sunday lunch, a meal that she had been working throughout the morning to prepare. Before my family moved back to the town where my parents grew up, even before I was born, because our sisters are much older, they would drive down and spend a few days around the holidays. And on the night before the family left to go back, my grandmother Jenny Bruce would sit up and she would sew. She would put the final touches on nightgowns or dresses that she had made for my sisters. She would mend up clothes that my family had brought to her to stitch up. And she'd work on that till about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And then she'd lay down for just a quick nap, get up around 5 o'clock, make a huge country breakfast for the family before we left. And she would pack a lunch for us, making sure that each person had his or her favorite sandwich for the day. My sister said to this day, it's hard to share, that her idea of comfort food is a sandwich hand-wrapped in wax paper. And as we left, we would see my grandmother, Jenny Bruce, dressed in her white nurse's uniform, ready to go out to another day of work. She and my grandfather worked very hard. They cared for their family. They put my mother through nursing school. They gave to other people, but they never really amassed much of a fortune themselves. That's the kind of people they were. And when I look at Proverbs 31, it feels as if the writer of Proverbs is talking about my grandmother, Jenny Bruce. The writer of Proverbs describes a woman who rises while it is still night and provides for her household, who puts her hand to the distaff and holds her hand to the spindle, who reaches out her hand to the needy, looks well to the need of her household. I see my grandmother Jenny Bruce in the writing from Proverbs 31. My father's mother died just the week after he was born. So he went to live with his oldest sister and her husband, who were in their early 20s and were not able to have children. And he grew up referring to them as Mama and Daddy. And I grew up knowing them as grandmother and grandfather. Her given name is one that she was not fond of. So she went by the name Ruth, which is a derivative of her actual given name. And my grandmother Ruth, by contrast, was very much a woman of business. She worked in a clothing store, and very quickly she saved up enough money to become a partner in the business. Her other partner was a Jewish man who owned partial ownership and control of a number of clothing stores in the region. During a time period when in that area, women and Jewish people were not necessarily known as being the people who were overseers or in control. That's the role that my grandmother had in this community. And she also very much wanted to bring name label products back to the small town. She was the first person to do that in her community. So that meant when it was time to go to market, she went to New York City to make sure she had the latest in fashion at that time. She, like others who grew up during the Depression, lived very simply and managed to make a dime do a dollar's work. She lived simply there, but when she went to New York for market, she lived high in the hall. She stayed at the Plaza. Her favorite restaurant was the Pen and Pencil, where their signature steak dish was her favorite thing to eat in the world. She went to see a number of Broadway plays, including plays that later became classics. The plays that she went to see read like a who's who of playwrights and entertainment giants from that time, such as seeing the Broadway debut of Paul Newman, starring opposite Geraldine Page and Tennessee Williams' Sweet Bird of Youth. It was her love of drama that she instilled in my father, who later went on to be a drama and English professor himself. My grandmother was always dressed to the nines, but she considered herself to be a walking billboard. So if somebody in her town complimented her on what she was wearing, she would thank them and very quickly say, "I have something similar to this in your size down at the store. And we can get you some shoes to match. Come and see me." We would go later on to my grandmother Ruth's house for Sunday lunch too. But unlike my other grandmother, she would not have cooked it because she hired someone who worked in her house who did the meals. A custom among people of her particular class setting, where we would have a big meal in the middle of the day and then just eat leftovers at night. And if we came into her house after church and the meal had already been prepared, we would find my grandmother Ruth in her housecoat, sitting back in her recliner, watching Meet the Press, about halfway through her first Bloody Mary of the day. And as I look at Proverbs 31, I see my grandmother Ruth there as well. The writer of Proverbs talks about a woman who seeks wool and flax, who tasks her servant, considers a field and buys it, perceives that her merchandise is profitable, her clothing is fine linen and purple. She sells garments, strength and dignity are her clothing. I see my grandmother Ruth here too. And you can see the women who have made an influence on your life in this passage as well. The NRSV translation of Proverbs 31 refers to her as the capable woman. And the list of characteristics and attributes are so great, there are more attributes than any one person could possibly embody. According to tradition, Proverbs is associated with King Solomon, and it is his advice to someone who is younger and just starting out. And if a young man were to go to try to find a mate who had every single one of the characteristics in Proverbs 31, he would likely stay single for the rest of his life. Proverbs is a part of what the Bible refers to as, or what Bible scholars refer to as Hebrew wisdom literature. Dr. Carol Newsom was a professor at my alma mater, and she was one of the leading experts in Hebrew wisdom literature. And she said when she reads Proverbs 31, she wonders what's going on with the husband of this capable one, and thinks that if rather than lounging around the city gates, he could get off his lazy duff and help her with some of her chores, then she too would be able to prop up her feet and enjoy some of the fruits of this vineyard she's worked so hard to produce. I see my grandmothers in this, and you see the capable women of your life in this text as well. Proverbs begins by talking about the gift of wisdom being the first of God's gifts, and through that creation, the rest of the creation comes into being. And the capable women that are embodied in Proverbs 31 in our lives are those women who embody this divine wisdom for us. We have learned from them. We have been nurtured from them. They have made us who we are. I'm thinking about the mothers who embraced us and held us on their laps when we cried, even when the reason we were upset may have been because we broke one of the rules that they set out for us themselves. I'm thinking of women that we encounter in school, not just the women who were in the classroom, but the women who were back in the kitchen preparing meals, the women who swept up the classroom floors, the women who cleaned the bathrooms, the women who did that kind of work and put money away so that their daughters could someday go to college. I'm thinking about the women who were teaching in the classrooms, the ones who were able to detect when we had a special gift for the subject that they taught, the ones who recommended text to us or gave us books to read on our own time, the ones who invited us to stay after school in the lab to work on some project or to receive some private tutor, those who went the extra mile, for which, of course, they didn't receive any overtime. I'm reminded of the professional women that you might have known, who recognize that you are someone who would excel in her field, the one who taught you some of the tricks of the trade, as my grandmother taught the physician that she worked with, the things that you could not learn in school. I'm reminded of those women that we worked for in work-study programs in school or in our first summer jobs. Those who took us when we were barely able to manage and discipline ourselves and taught us how to be professionals, how to follow a schedule, how to be on task,
how to deal well with customer service, even an unruly customer. Those women who taught us the things early in life that have served us throughout our lives. And of course, I'm reminded of the capable women that we encountered at church, the kindergarten or the first grade Sunday school teacher who taught us the words to Jesus loves me. The teacher a few grades later who helped us to memorize the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed. The teachers the grade after that who helped us to memorize the books of the Bible. The counselors in youth group who sat and listened to us when we were frustrated because we were trying to follow the teachings of Jesus, but it was hard amidst the backlash of peer pressure. I'm reminded of those women in church who did things for us that we weren't aware of at the time. Those women who were back in the kitchen preparing snacks for Vacation Bible School or lunch for other youth ministry events. Those women who maybe couldn't afford it but put aside their extra pennies to donate to the ministry programs that benefited us in our childhood and in our youth. And those very perceptive women who could just look at us and tell what we were going through and say a kind word to us or remember us in our prayers. And those of you who were extremely fortunate, you had the opportunity to hear female preachers. Preachers who, with their unique gift and perspective, opened up the scriptures to you, and it felt like you were seeing a completely different part of the Bible altogether. And it's just because they used their talent and their circumstances to peel away the years of male bias that influenced the way we read the Bible and opened up to you a whole new portion of the Scripture. These are the capable women of your life and mine. These are the ones who made us who we are. We honor and we continue their legacy when we become the kind of people they modeled for us, when we embody what they taught us to embody, when that gift of divine wisdom that they so beautifully carried on to them lives out in us. These are the capable women of our lives. Women who taught us to live with strength and dignity. Women who taught us the importance of hard work, but also of sharing what we have. Women who taught us how to be, through words and example, disciples of Jesus Christ.